Welcome to Granny's Justice, a place where secrets are spoken and silence finally ends. They say a mother's house is her temple of memories. Every corner whispers with the laughter of her child. Every wall carries the weight of her sacrifices. But what happens when that same child turns the lock and throws her out into the cold night? My name is Beatrice Eleanor Hayes. I am 76 years old, born and raised in Savannah, Georgia, and this is the story of the night.
My own son shut the door on me, a night that should have broken me, but instead lit the fire of a revenge the world would never forget. It was a humid summer night in Savannah. The cicadas sang in the distance, and the air was thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms. I had just returned from the church, my worn Bible tucked beneath my arm, when I saw it. The lock on my front door, my own door. For 76 years I had lived in this town, in that wooden house with chipped white paint and the rocking chair swaying on the porch. Every nail carried the sound of my husband's laughter. Every corner knew the first steps of my son, William. But that night, when I turned the knob, the door did not move. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Perhaps William had forgotten I would return late. Perhaps Rebecca, his wife, had locked it out of caution. But then, through the window, I heard it, Rebecca's shop. Cruel laughter slicing through the night like broken glass. "You did it," she whispered. "Yes," William answered. "She won't bother us anymore." My breath froze. My own son, my own blood. I stood there on the porch, hands trembling, the Bible slipping from my arms and hitting the wooden floor with a dull thud. The neighbors pretended not to see. Lights flickered on in their homes, but no one opened their doors. I sat on that porch the entire night, the stars above me, the cold earth beneath me. My heart was breaking, but my resolve was hardening. They thought they had erased me, but they didn't know I had been keeping records, receipts, letters, even Rebecca's whispered threats, written carefully in my diary. By dawn, I was no longer the same woman who had left for church the evening before. They had locked me out of my house, but in doing so, they had unlocked something far more dangerous. My silence was gone. And that morning, I made a vow. If they wanted war, they would have it. Dawn crept over the horizon, staining the Savannah sky in rose and gold. Inside me there was no sunrise, only a storm. My back ached from the wooden porch where I had spent the night. But my mind was clearer than it had been in years. Rebecca thought she had silenced me. William believed his betrayal would bury me in shame. They did not understand that silence is never neutral. It is either prison or power. Mine was about to become power. I picked up my Bible from the porch floor. Its leather cover was worn, its pages heavy with scripture and secrets. Tucked between verses were the notes I had hidden for years, receipts, scraps of correspondence, fragments of truth, my husband's pension papers, the deed to this house, even letters Rebecca had discarded, each one a small, undeniable proof of her real self. Memories turned to weapons. I remembered the day Rebecca first crossed this threshold, a smile polished for society that never reached her eyes. William, blinded by love or cunning, welcomed her with open arms. From the start, she resented me. The meals I cooked were old-fashioned. The counsel I offered, William, was outdated. I endured, as mothers do, until endurance became weakness, and weakness became exile. But I had been keeping count. Every insult, every manipulation, every forged signature Rebecca practiced with William. My diary was not mere words. It was testimony, a ledger of the violence cloaked in ordinary life. The neighbors silenced that morning. I walked past my neighbors' houses. Curtains twitched. Faces peered briefly, and then vanished. They had seen me shivering on the porch all night, and yet not one of them had opened a door or offered a blanket. I smiled quietly. Let them pretend. When the truth came to light, their silence would scorch them harder than it had ever scorched me. The first step of revenge, I went to the attic of an old friend where, years earlier, I had stowed a trunk. Inside lay my insurance policies, my husband's death certificate, receipts for every loan I had paid. I touched each paper as if it were sacred, because to me, it was. Each page was a stone. Together, they would become a wall that trapped Rebecca and William in their own lies. They had locked me out that night. Today, I was unlocking the path to their downfall. Closing scene of chapter. I laid the papers neatly on the table and whispered to myself, "They wanted war. They shall have war." The woman who once sat silent in a rocking chair had vanished. In her place stood Beatrice Eleanor Hayes, 76 years old, frail in body but steeled by a mother's righteous fury, sharpened into justice. The house they stole from me would become the stage of their ruin. The table was covered with papers, each one a memory carved into ink. My husband's death certificate, the deed to the house, the receipts of bills I had paid alone when William was too careless to remember. As I arranged them in a neat pile, I felt like a general preparing for war. Rebecca and William had imagined an old woman too tired to fight, too broken to stand. What they failed to see was that years of silence had not weakened me, they had sharpened me. That morning, I folded the documents into a leather folder and pressed it close to my chest. I knew the path ahead would be long, filled with whispers, ridicule, and legal battles. But I was ready. The lock they had placed on my door was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs unraveling. The first place I went was the small law office on Bay Street, where the windows faced the Savannah River. The name painted across the door read, Matthews and Clark, attorneys at law. Inside, the air smelled of paper, ink, and old coffee. A young secretary looked up at me, her eyes widening at the sight of a frail woman clutching a leather folder as if it were armor. "I need to see Mr. Clark," I said, my voice steady. Minutes later, a man in his late 40s entered, adjusting his glasses. He had the kind of expression that weighed people before they spoke. "Mrs. Hayes?" he asked. "Yes. And I'm here because my son believes he can steal my home. I want you to tell me if I'm right or if I'm mad." I laid the papers across his desk like cards in a game where losing was not an option. His eyes scanned them, page by page, his brows tightening. "You're not mad," he finally said. "You're sitting on evidence that could tear their case apart before it even begins." For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a small smile. Meanwhile, in the house that had once been mine, Rebecca was spinning her own web. She called neighbors, painting herself as the victim of a bitter, senile mother. She told them I had grown violent, that I had threatened her safety, that William had no choice but to protect his wife and his home. And some believed her. That was Rebecca's gift. Her voice dripped with conviction, her eyes gleamed with false innocence. She could make a lie sound like scripture. But lies rot quickly when exposed to light, and I knew it was only a matter of time before her mask cracked. My job was to make sure the whole city was watching when it did. One evening, as I walked back from the attorney's office, I passed the McAllisters' porch. They sat in their rocking chairs, sipping sweet tea, pretending not to notice me, but I caught a fragment of their whisper. "They say she's lost her mind. Imagine fighting your own son in court." "No," the other replied softly. "Imagine what he must have done to push her there." Their words floated in the air, heavy and sharp. For years, I had been invisible, just the old woman who attended church and baked pies for Sunday gatherings. But now, I was becoming a story, and stories have power. Days turned into weeks. Every morning, I visited Mr. Clark's office, adding more to the growing mountain of evidence. Receipts from the pharmacy, proof that I alone had paid for William's medication when he was a boy. Letters addressed to me, thanking me for donations Rebecca had claimed as her own. Witnesses who remembered my husband saying the house would always belong to me. Piece by piece, the puzzle was forming, and the image it created was devastating. "Mrs. Hayes," Clark said one afternoon, "if this goes to court, we will not just win, we will destroy them." I looked him in the eye and said, "Good, because I don't want survival, I want justice." Word of the lawsuit reached Rebecca quickly. Her laughter at the dinner table turned brittle. Her phone calls grew frantic. She visited old friends, begging them to testify on her behalf. But loyalty built on manipulation crumbles fast. Soon, invitations dried up. People stopped answering her calls. At the grocery store, whispers followed her like shadows. "Isn't that the woman who threw her mother-in-law? They say the old woman is taking her to court. I heard she has proof." Rebecca's shoulders hunched lower each day, but she was far from finished. Cornered animals are always the most dangerous. The day the court summons arrived, I felt the weight of destiny in my hands. The paper was thin, but it carried the force of centuries of mothers who had been silenced, erased, discarded. This was more than my battle. It was every woman's battle who had been told her life no longer mattered once her youth had faded. That night, I sat at my friend's kitchen table, the summons spread before me. I whispered a prayer, not for mercy, not for peace, but for strength. "They think I am alone," I said into the quiet, "but I carry generations with me." The courthouse loomed, tall and stern, its white pillars cracked with age. On the morning of the first hearing, I walked up those steps slowly but proudly, clutching my folder like a sword. Inside, Rebecca sat in her finest clothes, pearls at her throat, her expression composed, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted, restless, afraid. William sat beside her, avoiding my gaze. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, and when my attorney stood to speak, silence turned into the sound of walls crumbling. He presented the deed, he presented the receipts, he presented the letters, and then he opened my diary, reading aloud the words I had written the night they locked me out. "They have stolen my home, but they will not steal my truth." The courtroom gasped. Rebecca's face flushed red. William's head dropped into his hands. That hearing did not end the war, but it turned the tide. The judge froze Rebecca's access to the house and ordered an investigation into the forged signatures. The newspapers picked up the story. Elderly woman battles son and daughter-in-law for stolen home. Rebecca Hayes accused of manipulation and fraud. For the first time, the city that had once looked away now stared directly at them, and what they saw was not the picture-perfect couple Rebecca had painted, but cracks spreading across the glass. That night, as I sat by the window of my temporary home, the Savannah air heavy with the scent of rain, I felt a calmness settle over me. The storm was no longer inside me, it was outside, gathering strength. Rebecca thought she had won by locking me out. William thought he had erased me by choosing her over me. But the truth is simple. You cannot erase a mother who remembers, and I remembered everything. This was only the beginning. I whispered to the night, "The fire is coming." And somewhere across the city, in the house that was still legally mine, Rebecca must have felt it too, because even in her sleep, I am certain she shivered. The following week, Savannah awoke not to the usual hum of cicadas or the scent of magnolia blossoms, but to headlines that carried my name. Beatrice Eleanor Hayes battles for justice. Son and daughter-in-law accused of betraying elderly mother. I had become more than a story whispered over fences. I was ink on paper now, my face printed in black and white, my fight laid bare for every curious eye to consume. And with visibility came something Rebecca had never prepared for: scrutiny. Neighbors who once closed their blinds now stared openly. Some even nodded at me when I walked by, shame etched into their faces for their earlier silence. But for every nod of sympathy, there was also gossip, words twisted, questions whispered. Why fight your own son? Is she doing this for money? Maybe she really is losing her mind. The city was divided, and that division was the fuel to my fire. Rebecca was not the kind of woman to accept defeat with grace. She doubled down, using every weapon in her arsenal. She filed appeals, dragging me back to court at every opportunity. She called in favors from her wealthy acquaintances, though fewer and fewer returned her calls. She even staged tears in public, her voice trembling as she told strangers how cruel it was for an old woman to drag her family into court. And then came the attack that cut deeper than most. She accused me of senility. Rebecca petitioned the court to declare me mentally unfit, claiming I was hallucinating events that never happened. She hired doctors to testify that my memory was failing, that I could no longer distinguish between past and present. When I heard the news, I sat in silence for a long time, not because I was afraid, but because I realized the depth of her desperation. "You want to call me mad," I whispered to myself, "then let me show the world how sharp madness can be." In all of this, William remained a shadow. He sat beside Rebecca in court, his jaw tight, his eyes downcast. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were rehearsed, hollow, as though they had been placed in his mouth by Rebecca herself. But I could still see my son buried somewhere in that silence. The boy who once ran barefoot through the garden, laughing when I chased him with a wooden spoon. The young man who had held my hand at his father's funeral, whispering, "It's just us now, Mama." Where had that boy gone? Was he dead inside, or merely trapped? The question haunted me more than Rebecca's schemes ever could. It was during the third hearing that the tide shifted again. My attorney, Mr. Clark, had been quietly working on something, a witness I didn't know existed. When the judge called the next testimony, the courtroom doors opened, and in walked Mrs. Porter, an elderly neighbor who had once lived across the street from us. She was frail, leaning heavily on her cane, but her voice carried decades of truth. "I saw it," she told the court. "I saw the night Mrs. Hayes was locked out. I heard her crying on the porch, and I heard Rebecca laughing inside. I saw William walk to the door, look at his mother, and turn away." The courtroom gasped. Rebecca's face drained of color. William's head snapped up, his lips parting, his eyes darting wildly between me and the witness. For the first time, The truth had been spoken not by me, not by my lawyer, but by someone with nothing to gain, and that truth was a knife. The days that followed were brutal for Rebecca. Her friends abandoned her, her family stopped answering her calls, the businesses she frequented began to look at her differently, not as the poised socialite she pretended to be, but as a pariah. Still, she fought. She filed more motions, accused Mrs. Porter of confusion, claimed I had bribed her, but each move only exposed more of her desperation. I watched her unravel piece by piece, her carefully curated mask slipping with every court date, her once perfect hair hung limp, her smile became strained, her eyes darted like a cornered animal. The fire was spreading, and it was consuming her. One evening, as the court adjourned, I lingered in the hallway, my hand resting on the cool marble wall. That's when William approached me, his steps hesitant. "Mother," he said softly. It was the first word he had spoken to me in weeks. My heart clenched, but I kept my face steady. "You don't have to do this," he whispered. "We can end it here. Walk away, please." I turned to him, my voice low but firm. "Walk away. You locked me out of my own home, William. You watched as your wife laughed at me, humiliated me. You turned your back when I needed you most. This is not about ending. This is about truth." His lips trembled, but he said nothing more. Rebecca called his name sharply from across the hall, and like a dog to its leash, he returned to her side. But in his eyes, I saw something crack. By the time the fourth hearing began, the entire city seemed to have chosen a side. The courtroom was packed, not just with lawyers and witnesses, but with ordinary people who wanted to see what justice would look like when stripped of wealth and lies. Mr. Clock presented the latest evidence, a set of financial documents showing that Rebecca had siphoned money from my late husband's pension, forging William's signature to do it. The judge's face hardened. Gasps echoed through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. Rebecca's voice rose in protest, shrill and desperate, but no one listened. Her words fell flat, her once commanding presence reduced to a flailing shadow. And I sat there, calm, steady, the fire no longer hidden inside me but burning in plain sight for all to see. That night, as I left the courthouse, the air was thick with humidity, the sky heavy with storm clouds. People lined the steps, some reaching out to touch my hand, others whispering words of encouragement. I had become more than Beatrice Eleanor Hayes, the old woman locked out of her home. I had become a symbol, and symbols cannot be erased. Rebecca had thought she was waging war against a frail body. What she failed to see was that she had awakened a spirit that had been silent for too long. The fire had spread from me, to the courtroom, to the city itself, and it was only growing stronger. But I knew her well enough to understand. She would not surrender. Rebecca was a woman who thrived on control, and when control slipped, she clawed harder. Rumors began to circulate that she was planning something reckless, selling assets in secret, reaching out to distant relatives for support, even threatening to expose William's private misdeeds if he ever turned against her. She was cornered, and cornered enemies make the deadliest mistakes. I waited, patient, watchful. Because I knew the fire would not just consume her lies, it would consume her entirely. That as I sat by the window that evening, watching the storm finally break over Savannah, rain pounding the earth with relentless force, I whispered to myself, they locked me out once, but now, the world is locking them out. Thunder rolled across the sky, lightning split the darkness. And in that moment, I knew this war was no longer just mine. It belonged to every voice that had ever been silenced, every mother who had ever been betrayed. The fire was here, and it was unstoppable. The storm that raged over Savannah that night seemed almost prophetic. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder roared across the sky, and lightning split the night into fragments of white fire. I sat at the table, papers spread before me, each one now heavy with the weight of possibility. The judge had frozen Rebecca's access to my home. The city was whispering louder than ever. The tide was shifting, but I knew better than to celebrate. Rebecca wasn't finished. She was wounded, cornered, furious, and when such a woman is desperate, she does not collapse quietly, she claws. The very next morning, Rebecca made her move. She arrived at the courthouse flanked by 2 new lawyers, polished men in dark suits, their briefcases snapping open like weapons. She had spent what little influence she had left, draining favors, promising debts, clinging to whatever scraps of power remained. Her new claim was audacious, that the house had never truly been mine, that my husband had intended it for William, that I had manipulated documents, that I had forged signatures in my grief. The irony nearly made me laugh. Rebecca had grown so tangled in her own lies that she had begun to choke on them. Yet, in court, even lies, no matter how absurd, must still be answered. That day, the courtroom was packed to bursting. Reporters lined the benches, pens scratching, cameras flashing when allowed. Ordinary townsfolk filled every available space, eager to see the battle unfold. Rebecca's lawyers spoke first, their words slick as oil. They painted me as a bitter, manipulative widow who could not bear to see her son happy. They claimed my diary was fabricated, my witnesses unreliable, my documents forged. The judge listened, his expression unreadable, but I noticed the tightening of his jaw. Patience has limits, even in court. When my attorney, Mr. Clark, stood, his voice cut clean through the fog of deception. "Your Honor," he said firmly, "we have tolerated their baseless claims long enough. Today, we bring the truth, undeniable, irrefutable truth." He called me to the stand. My hands trembled as I placed them on the Bible, swearing to tell the truth. But my voice, when it came, was steady. I told the court about the night I was locked out. I described the laughter from within, the silence of my son, the cold wood of the porch beneath me. I spoke of the diary I had kept, the receipts I had saved, the trunk of documents that proved years of sacrifice. Then Mr. Clark pulled out something I had not expected. Double quotes Mrs. Hayes. He said, "Do you recognize this?" He held up an envelope, yellowed with age. My breath caught. It was a letter, my husband's letter. The letter he had written months before his death, declaring in his own hand that the house was to remain in my name until the day I died. A letter William had once pretended to misplace. The courtroom fell silent. The judge leaned forward, reading each word carefully. Rebecca's face went pale, her lips trembling. She hadn't known this letter existed. And in that moment, the ground beneath her lies gave way. The judge turned his gaze to William. "Mr. Hayes, did you know of this letter?" William's mouth opened, closed, opened again. His eyes darted to Rebecca, who stared at him with a glare sharp enough to cut stone. He stammered. I knew." Gasps rippled through the room. Rebecca hissed under her breath, her hand clutching his arm like claws. But it was too late. In those few words, William had undone months of Rebecca's careful manipulation. He had revealed himself complicit, yes, but also revealed her as the puppeteer. And for the first time, I saw my son's face, not as a stranger's spot, as a broken man realizing the depth of his betrayal. Reporters scrambled, pens flying, whispers turning into shouts. The judge banged his gavel for silence, his voice booming. "This court will not tolerate further deception. The evidence is clear, and the testimony confirms it. Mrs. Hayes' ownership of the property is undeniable. Any further attempts to discredit her will be treated as contempt." Rebecca's lawyers sat back, their faces grim. Their client was slipping through their fingers, but Rebecca wasn't done. Not yet. She stood suddenly, her voice shrill, echoing across the chamber. "She's lying. She's poisoned you all with her sweet little act, but she's nothing but a bitter old woman. You'll regret siding with her. You'll all regret it." Her outburst rang in the silence that followed, her mask shattering once and for all. The judge's gaze was cold. "Mrs. Hayes," he said firmly, "sit down, or you will be removed." But Rebecca had already destroyed herself. When the hearing adjourned, the courthouse steps became a battlefield of cameras and questions. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward. "How does it feel to finally be heard? Do you think your son will stand by his wife? What message do you have for other mothers going through betrayal?" I paused, looking out at the sea of faces. My heart ached, not for myself, but for the boy William once was. But pity could not outweigh justice. "My message," I said clearly, "is this. You cannot silence a mother's truth. You can lock her out of her home, but you cannot lock her out of justice. And justice always finds its way." The crowd erupted in applause. Rebecca, shielded by her lawyers, was ushered into a waiting car, her face hidden behind dark glasses. But no glass, no curtain, could hide her disgrace. That evening, as I left the courthouse, I found William waiting by the steps. Rain still drizzled, the storm lingering. His suit was damp, his hair plastered to his forehead. "Mother," he whispered, his voice broken. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I looked at him, my heart torn between fury and sorrow. "You didn't mean," I asked softly. "You watched me suffer. You let her laugh while I cried outside my own door. And you call that not meaning?" Tears welled in his eyes. "I was weak, yes," I said. "And weakness is its own betrayal." I walked past him, my steps slow but unshaken. His sobs followed me into the night, but they were no longer my burden. The final judgment had not yet been delivered, but the city had already spoken. Invitations for Rebecca had dried up completely. Businesses refused her credit. Even her family avoided her calls. She walked the streets alone now, shoulders hunched, whispers chasing her like shadows. The woman who once strutted with confidence now moved like prey, hunted by the truth she had tried so hard to bury. And I was no longer invisible. The neighbors, who had once turned their heads, now greeted me with warmth, with respect, even with apology. The church bells that had tolled indifferently now seemed to ring in my name. The storm had broken, and in its aftermath, the fire still burned, steady, bright, unstoppable. That night, as I sat by the window of the house that was once again mine in spirit, if not yet on paper, I whispered a vow into the silence. They thought I would be erased. They thought I would fade into nothing. But I will not fade. I will rise, and they will fall. This is not the end. This is only the reckoning. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle, the thunder fading, but within me, the storm still raged. The fire had spread, and soon it would consume everything they had left. The courthouse stood tall against the morning sun, its white pillars streaked with rainwater from the night before. Savannah was waking slowly, but my heart was already pounding with the rhythm of inevitability. The final judgment was near. For weeks, the hearings had dragged on. Each day peeled back another layer of Rebecca's lies. Each witness chipped away at her facade. Each document cemented the truth. And yet, the weight for justice felt heavier than all the evidence combined. I had sat in my small rented room the night before, staring at the folder of papers that had carried me through this war. My husband's letter, my receipts, my diary. Each page had become a weapon. But the greatest weapon was not the paper. It was endurance. Endurance had turned to strength. Strength had turned to fire. And fire had become justice. That Rebecca was unraveling. And the city saw it. She no longer appeared in the designer dresses that once clung to her body like armor. Now she wore plain clothes, her hair pulled back tightly, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. The pearls she once flaunted were gone. Yet her tongue was as sharp as ever. She accused me of witchcraft, of manipulation, of casting some spell on the court. She filed a motion demanding my diary be destroyed as emotional fiction. Even attempted to bribe a clerk. And that attempt backfired spectacularly when the man turned her in to the judge. Every move she made only exposed her further. Savannah whispered about her now, not with admiration but with scorn. She thought she could outwit everyone. She built her house of lies, and it's burning. Imagine throwing your husband's mother out of her home. Her empire had crumbled to dust, but she clung to William as though he were her last defense. That William had become a ghost of himself. In court, he barely spoke. His once confident posture reduced to slumped shoulders and trembling hands. He looked at me often now, not with defiance, not with love, but with guilt so thick it choked him. During a recess, he approached me. His voice was low, almost broken. "Mother," he whispered, "I've made mistakes. My tone was cold. "You call betrayal a mistake. You call silence a mistake. You call turning the key on your own mother's door a mistake." His lips quivered, tears welling in his eyes. I thought I was protecting her. And who protected me? I asked. He had no answer. He walked away, shoulders bent, Rebecca's shadow dragging him down like chains. By then, Savannah had chosen sides. The church that once remained neutral now prayed openly for me on Sunday mornings. Neighbors who had closed their blinds that terrible night now brought food to my doorstep, their shame written across their faces. The newspapers no longer asked if Rebecca was guilty. They asked how soon the judgment would come. Rebecca had become the villain of Savannah, and I had become its reluctant heroine. The day of the final hearing, the courtroom was overflowing. Reporters packed the aisles. Townsfolk filled the benches. Even strangers who had never known me came to witness what they called the trial of betrayal. Rebecca sat at the defense table, her eyes sunken, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles whitened. William sat beside her, his head bowed. When the judge entered, silence fell like a stone. Today, he began. This court delivers its verdict in the matter of Beatrice Eleanor Hayes versus William and Rebecca Hayes. The air was electric, every breath suspended. The judge spoke slowly, his words deliberate. The evidence presented before this court is overwhelming. The deed to the Hayes residence is legally and unequivocally the property of Mrs. Beatrice Eleanor Hayes. The attempts to transfer ownership through forged signatures and fraudulent claims are hereby declared null and void. Gasps rippled through the room. Rebecca's face went white. Furthermore, the judge continued, this court recognizes the deliberate emotional and financial abuse inflicted upon Mrs. Hayes by her daughter-in-law, Rebecca Hayes, with the complicit silence of William Hayes. Effective immediately, Mrs. Hayes retains full ownership and rights to her home. Rebecca Hayes is barred from the property. And as for William Hayes, he paused, his gaze sharp. William flinched. This court spares you only because you have admitted your role, though your silence remains a stain. Consider this your final warning. Should you attempt to defy this ruling, consequences will be swift. The gavel struck. Justice had spoken. The courtroom erupted. Reporters swarmed, flashes of light capturing Rebecca's collapse as she screamed, her voice hoarse with rage. She lunged at the judge's bench, her lawyers restraining her as she shrieked about conspiracies, betrayal, curses. Liar, she's a liar. You'll all regret this. Her voice cracked, the sound no longer sharp but pitiful. Broken. William tried to steady her, but she pulled away, her hands shaking violently. For the first time, the city saw her not as a cunning woman, but as a fallen queen, stripped of her crown, humiliated before all. The whispers filled the room. She's finished. She destroyed herself. Beatrice won. When I walked down those courthouse steps, the air outside felt lighter, cleaner. Reporters shouted questions. Neighbors clapped. Strangers reached out to shake my hand, but I didn't smile. Victory wasn't sweet. It was heavy, carved from pain and betrayal. Still, it was mine. Later that evening, I stood before my house once more. The same chipped white paint, the same rocking chair on the porch, the same door that had once been locked against me. But now the key was in my hand. I turned it slowly, the sound of the lock clicking open, echoing like thunder in my ears. The door swung wide, and for the first time in months, I stepped back into the home that had been stolen from me. Tears blurred my vision, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were the tears of a woman who had fought, endured, and won. News traveled quickly. Rebecca had left Savannah that very night, her reputation in ashes. Some said she fled to her family in Charleston. Others whispered she had been admitted to a private clinic, her mind unraveling under the weight of disgrace. As for William, he stayed behind, but not at my house. He wandered, lost, a man who had sacrificed his soul to the wrong woman and was left with nothing. I did not hate him, but I could not forgive him either. Forgiveness is a gift, and he had squandered every chance to earn it. He was no longer my son. He was a stranger. That night, as I sat in my rocking chair on the porch, the cicadas humming, the magnolia scent drifting through the air, I felt a peace I had not known in years. But it was not just peace, it was vindication. Rebecca thought she had erased me. William thought he had buried me in silence. But silence is never the end. Silence is the spark before fire. And my fire had burned them both to ashes. I whispered into the night, my voice steady, my spirit unbroken. They locked me out, but I walked back in, and the world saw them fall. The rocking chair creaked beneath me, steady and strong. The house stood tall once more, and so did I. The house smelled of dust and abandonment when I first stepped inside. The curtains hung stiff, untouched for months. A thin film of neglect clung to the wooden floors, and the air carried a stillness that whispered of betrayal. I walked slowly through each room, my fingertips grazing familiar walls. Every corner held echoes of laughter, arguments, whispered prayers, but layered over them now was the faint shadow of intrusion. Rebecca's presence clinging like smoke after a fire. In the kitchen, dishes were stacked carelessly, evidence of her reckless living. In my bedroom, dresser drawers had been rifled through, clothes tossed aside. My rocking chair, once positioned by the window for the afternoon light, had been shoved into a corner. I stood in that room for a long time, the weight of it pressing down on me. Then I straightened the chair, set it back where it belonged, and sat down. The creak of its wooden frame was like the heartbeat of the house returning to life. Savannah was a city of whispers, and now it whispered my name everywhere. At the market, people approached me cautiously, their smiles tentative, their apologies awkward. "Mrs. Hayes," one woman murmured, "we should have done more. We should have helped you that night." Another man pressed a hand to his chest, his voice breaking. I saw you on that porch. I looked away. I'll never forgive myself for that. I listened, but I did not absolve. Forgiveness was not mine to grant so easily. They had chosen silence once. Now they lived with its shame. Yet I saw something new in their eyes. Not pity, not dismissal, but respect. I was no longer invisible. And respect, I realized, was its own form of victory. Rumors of Rebecca spread like wildfire. Some said she had fled to Charleston, hiding in her family's crumbling estate. Others claimed she had been admitted to a private clinic after a breakdown, her mind unraveling beneath the weight of disgrace. Wherever she was no longer the woman who had strutted through Savannah in pearls and pride. She had become a cautionary tale, a name spoken with disdain, a lesson in how quickly false power collapses. The city no longer feared her, it pitied her, and pity, for someone like Rebecca, was worse than hatred. And William, my son, he remained in Savannah, but he was a hollow man. His friends abandoned him, his reputation tarnished beyond repair. Employers turned him away, unwilling to be associated with his name. Even neighbors crossed the street to avoid him. He wandered the city like a ghost, shoulders hunched, eyes vacant. More than once, I saw him standing outside my house at night, his face half hidden in shadow. He never knocked, he never spoke. He only stood there, watching, before disappearing again into the darkness. I wanted to feel anger. I wanted to scream at him for his betrayal, to curse him for choosing Rebecca over me. But what I felt instead was something heavier. Sorrow. He was my son, yes, but he was also a man who had destroyed himself, and there are wounds even a mother cannot heal. The neighbors who had once turned their heads were now desperate to rewrite their roles in my story. They brought pies, casseroles, flowers, apologies wrapped in trembling voices. We didn't know how bad it was. We thought it wasn't our place. We're so sorry. I accepted their offerings but not their excuses. Silence is a choice, and they had chosen it. Their guilt was theirs to carry, not mine to wash away. Yet, as I looked at their faces, lined with shame, heavy with regret, I realized something important. My fight had changed them too. No one in Savannah would ever again turn their head so easily. They had seen the cost of silence. They had witnessed the fire. The newspapers continued to print my story. Reporters came to my door, asking for interviews, asking for statements. My words were quoted, my picture printed, my name carried beyond Savannah's borders. Elderly woman wins against betrayal. Justice for Beatrice Hayes becomes symbol for elder rights. Advocates reached out from other towns, even other states, citing my case as inspiration for reforms, for new protections for the elderly. I had not sought to become a symbol. I had only sought justice. But sometimes justice, once found, grows larger than the one who claimed it, and I embraced it, not for me, but for every mother, every woman, every soul who had been silenced. As weeks turned into months, life settled into a rhythm again. I cooked in my kitchen, I tended the roses in my garden, I read my Bible by the afternoon light, but the quiet was never the same. It carried with it the echo of everything I had endured. Every time I heard the creak of the rocking chair, I remembered the porch where I had been locked out. Every time I turned a key in the door, I remembered the night it had been barred against me. The pain never vanished, but it transformed. It became a reminder of survival, of strength, of the fire that had burned but not consumed me. One night, as the cicadas hummed and the moonlight bathed the porch, I heard a knock, slow, hesitant, almost ashamed. When I opened the door, William stood there. His clothes were worn, his face unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed. "Mother," he whispered. I said nothing. I have nowhere else to go," he confessed, his voice cracking. "She's gone. Everyone's gone. I've lost everything." I studied him, the son I had raised, the man who had betrayed me, the stranger who now stood on my porch like a beggar. "I warned you once," I said quietly. "Weakness is its own betrayal, and you chose it." Tears streamed down his face. I know, I did not let him in. I did not slam the door either. I simply left him standing there, caught between the warmth of the home he had forsaken and the cold night he had chosen. The city never forgot my story. Laws were drafted in its shadow, sermons preached in its light. People told their children about the old woman who refused to be erased, who fought back when everyone else looked away. Rebecca was gone. William was broken. The neighbors were changed. And I was not the same woman who once sat silently in her rocking chair, knitting away her years. I was Beatrice Eleanor Hayes, 76 years old, survivor of betrayal, bearer of truth, keeper of fire, and though my body would one day fail, my story would not. On a quiet Sunday evening, as the sun set over Savannah and the church bells rang in the distance, I sat once more on my porch. The magnolia scent drifted on the breeze, the rocking chair creaked beneath me, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to smile. They thought I was finished, I whispered, but I became the beginning. The fire still burned, steady and bright, not to destroy anymore, but to light the way, and in its glow, I knew the reckoning was not just mine. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, everyone who had ever been betrayed. The storm had passed, the ashes remained, but from ashes, new things grow, and I was not done growing. The days after my return home were quieter, yet the silence was no longer the prison it had once been. It was a silence that carried weight, yes, but it was the weight of victory, of lessons carved deep into the wood and stone of my home. When I walked down the streets of Savannah now, people no longer turned away. They greeted me by name, they looked me in the eye. For some, it was apology. For others, it was respect. For many, it was, I had not asked for this role, had not sought to become a symbol, but the truth was undeniable. I had become one. My fight was no longer only mine. It belonged to everyone who had been silenced, discarded, betrayed. News of Rebecca drifted in fragments. One rumor said she had been seen in Charleston, her once proud family refusing to acknowledge her. Another claimed she had moved from city to city, never staying long, her reputation rotting behind her like a trail of smoke. But the most persistent whispers said she had fallen into despair, living in isolation, her mind unraveling under the weight of her disgrace. No one truly knew, and in truth, it no longer mattered. Rebecca had been the architect of her own ruin. My revenge was not her collapse. It was my survival, my rise, my return. She could vanish into shadows. I would remain in the light. And William, my son, his decline was slower, more painful. He stayed in Savannah, drifting like a leaf in storm water. He sought work, but found none, his name forever tied to betrayal. He sought friendship, but was met with silence. Even the church, once his refuge, treated him as a cautionary tale. He came to my porch again, weeks later. His face was gaunt, his voice a whisper. "Mother, I don't deserve forgiveness. I only want to hear your voice again." I looked at him for a long time, my heart torn. He was my son, yes, but he had chosen betrayal, silence, weakness, and choices carry consequences. "You heard my voice once," I said softly. "The night you turned the key, you chose not to listen. That choice cannot be undone." He wept, shoulders shaking, but I did not reach for him. Some lessons are not mine to teach anymore. Some pain is earned. William walked away into the night, and though I mourned, I did not follow. The neighbors who had turned their eyes away that night were forever changed. One by one, they confessed their shame. They had heard me on the porch. They had seen me shivering in the dark, and yet they had done nothing. Their silence haunted them now. But guilt can be a teacher. Soon, they became louder in other battles. They spoke up for other women, other elders, other neighbors who were being dismissed. My fight had cracked something open in Savannah. The city had learned that silence is not safety, it is complicity. And though their apologies could never erase that night, I accepted the change, for change was its own form of justice. Months passed, and my story traveled farther than I ever imagined. Advocates for the elderly wrote letters thanking me for inspiring them. Journalists from other states came to interview me. Laws were drafted in my name, protections proposed for mothers, widows, women who had been silenced by those meant to protect them. I was not just Beatrice Eleanor Hayes anymore. I had become a symbol, the grandmother who refused to be erased, the woman who rose from betrayal, the fire that burned lies to ash. And as I sat on my porch each evening, the rocking chair creaking beneath me, I realized something profound. My revenge had grown beyond me. It had become justice, and justice does not die with one person. It carries forward. I thought often of my husband, of his laughter, his steady hands, his promise that the house would always be mine. His letter had saved me in court, yes, but more than that, his memory had carried me through the darkest nights. I thought of the little boy William had once been, running barefoot in the garden, chasing fireflies with his pockets full of dirt. That boy was gone, consumed by choices he had made, but in my heart, I prayed that somewhere, somehow, he might find a fragment of redemption. and I thought of Rebecca, not with hatred anymore, but with the kind of pity one feels for a storm that has blown itself out. She had wanted to erase me, but instead she had erased herself. The truth had endured, the fire had endured, I had endured. One evening, as the sun set over Savannah, the magnolia blossoms glowing in the golden light, I sat on my porch and spoke aloud, not to anyone in particular, but to the world. They locked me out. They laughed as I wept. They thought I would fade into silence. But I turned silence into fire, and fire does not fade. It spreads. It consumes. It purifies. They thought they had ended me, but I was not the ending. I was the beginning of something they could never stop. The cicadas hummed, the rocking chair creaked, and the air felt lighter. I had told my story. I had lived my revenge. I had seen justice, and now the world would carry it forward. Rebecca was gone, her name spoken only as a warning. William was broken, wandering shadows of regret. The neighbors were changed, their silence forever a scar, their voices now louder. The city remembered, the world listened, and I remained, not as a victim, not as a forgotten old woman, but as a survivor, a fighter, a fire that had burned through betrayal and emerged unbroken. If you have walked with me through this journey, if you have felt the weight of betrayal, the sting of silence, and the triumph of justice, then let my story remind you of this. Never underestimate the fire in someone you think is too weak to fight, because sometimes the quietest voice becomes the loudest flame. They thought I was finished, but I became the beginning.